Hologram technologies are trending in professional communication and technology studies. In industry, holograms are showing up everywhere from museums, concerts, to resurrect artists who have passed, and even the Kardashians' living rooms using Proto Hologram technologies. However, hologram beings aren't new technology. In fact, French philosopher Jean Baudrillard would argue that humans have been transitioning into hologram beings since the invention of Western colonialism. Jean Baudrillard was a French sociologist and philosopher with an interest in cultural studies. He is best known for his analyses of media, contemporary culture, and technology, as well as his formulation of concepts such as hyperreality, which we will be discussing in this video. Baudrillard defined hyperreality in his book Simulacra and Simulation. This work is often compared to films like The Matrix. The Matrix is a 1999 sci-fi action film that follows main character Neo, a hacker who discovers the reality he knows is a simulated world controlled by machines that enslave humanity. Guided by Morpheus and Trinity, he joins a rebellion to uncover his destiny as the One and fight against the oppressive system. The Matrix is often compared to Baudrillard's work because it pushes beyond an order of bodily relations in the world and asks a provocative question. Is contemporary life just a simulation mediated through screens? To understand hyperreality, we must first understand what a simulation is. Simulation is different from pretending to be something. For example, we can pretend to be an indigenous person by dressing up as Pocahontas for Halloween. Though many people believe dressing up as Pocahontas is a form of redface and an offensive act of appropriation, many people still attempt to dress up as an indigenous person through costume and dress. While offensive, when we pretend to be something, when we wear a Halloween costume, there is some acknowledgement that we are playing out a fantasy and not actually becoming that thing that is being represented. However, a simulation is different from pretending. A simulation is an abstraction of the original object. It is a clone of the original, the double, the mirror, or even the concept repeated. So, dressing up as Pocahontas is also a simulation of sort. It's the playing out of a double meant to replace an idea that doesn't exist anymore, the Indian princess, come and gone with Western settler colonialism. Whereas pretending leaves reality intact, a simulation tries to distort reality around us by emulating what is real. There is both the costume in the act of dressing up as Pocahontas, but then there's also the act, the colonial act of trying to replace the indigenous peoples who used to live in Canada and the United States. However, simulation is not representation either. It's not like a costume. To simulate is to create a false reality. For example, since the advent of the internet's usage on home computers, we have lived in a world mediated through simulations on screens, where we can effectively become simulations of whatever we please. Someone could go online right now, change their avatar, and create a whole profile pretending to be an indigenous person and would effectively become a simulation of that thing. Our social lives as humans are no longer just physical and mediated through real world interactions. We live in the hyper real, which is more than an abstraction of the real. It's a model of the real. It mimics the real. And Baudrillard often calls this a miniature of the real. The simulations of the world we represent, like the image of Pocahontas that serves the narrative of Western history, have been repeated so many times since their inception, since the advent of Western colonialism. They no longer refer to anything real. They are without origin. This is hyperreality. How can we know what is truly real anymore? So, what does the simulation represent? Baudrillard calls this the precession of simulacra, that which precedes the simulation. However, this becomes hard to define because it has been so repeated throughout Western history. There are so many repetitions that the image now precedes the real. We think of the image without knowing what it really was. For instance, when we simulate Pocahontas, we are perhaps trying to represent the first Indian princess, whose relationships with settler men paved the way for European colonization of North America. But was Pocahontas the original Indian princess? Historians would say that the stories we tell about the historical figure Pocahontas are an amalgamation of stereotypes and fantasies that appeared in explorer stories about Indigenous women at contact, many of which have been debunked as untrue. There have been so many repetitions of the image of Pocahontas that her image and the image of the Indian princess now precedes the reality of who Indigenous women in the Americas actually were at contact and who they are today. Even though the British colonial era has come to an end, we are still impacted by the images created during this era. The simulation of these images destroy what is being represented, Indigenous peoples. Only the allegory of the empire remains, says Baudrillard. The ongoing supremacy of Western empiricism and logic is what present-day simulators attempt to make real, he argues. This is a destruction, a liquidation, a substitution. There is no order of signs referring to the original object anymore. This is not a parody, imitation, or even a duplication of Pocahontas and the Indian princess. The simulation tries to replace the original object. Within colonial logic, the simulation of the Indian princess in the American consciousness replaces any reality about Indigenous women and any indication that Indigenous peoples still exist. It upholds Western colonialism and all its ideologies today. Iconoclasm refers to the deliberate destruction or rejection of icons, images, or symbols that are regarded as sacred. Baudrillard argues that we have destroyed images so much as a society that there is now an omnipotence of simulacra that is akin to God. Omnipotence means everywhere and all-seeing like God. So Baudrillard is arguing that we live in a world that worships images, which is progressive considering he passed away before influencer culture on the internet really took off, before Kim Kardashian took her first selfie. We erase God in contemporary society and replace him with a simulation that destroys images by imitating them and ultimately replacing the original. Baudrillard calls this the visible machinery of icons. It's a technology of society that operates around the circulation of images. We are always trying to be the perfect simulacra, the perfect copy of the original, but we don't even know what the original was. Baudrillard even goes so far as to say that simulation is the basis of Western Christianity and faith and the colonial project, and is now the foundation of Western society. Western ideology is based on the presumption that a simulation can replace the real, to dominate it, to own it, to exert power over it. What does this mean for the context of indigenous philosophies? How can an image reduce entire systems of language, culture, and spirituality to be simulated? It would be the same as simulating God, says Baudrillard. Therefore, the system would lose all emotion, care, reciprocity, humanity, goodness. Nostalgia replaces meaning, he says. And we can see this in the way that colonial logics place indigenous cultures in the past as something to be studied or put in a museum, but not something that is active today. Baudrillard uses the example of the Tassajay people who are indigenous to the Philippines. The Tassajay peoples were being studied by ethnographic anthropologists, but their cultures were disappearing and dying by virtue of being discovered because, after so-called discovery, they were integrated into dominant indigenous and colonial societies in the area, and the Tassajay culture and language was lost. So Baudrillard calls this order, this colonial order, the open museum, where indigenous peoples are fossilized alive in a snapshot. The museum is everywhere now, like a dimension of life. We have to exhume the past and memorialize it and archive it to normalize the current colonial order of life and the superiority of civilization over indigenous ways of life. The West is seized with panic at the thought of not being able to save what the symbolic order had been able to conserve. Our entire linear and accumulative culture collapses if we cannot stockpile the past in plain view. In Simulacra and Simulation, Baudrillard critiques Disneyland, calling it a miniature of American values and ideals. The wonder and magic that Disneyland produces is a hyper-reality that both teaches Americans who they should be as a society, while also attempting to create a hologram of that society. As Baudrillard reflects many times in his text, who is representing whom becomes unintelligible. The image of the Indian princess in Disney's Pocahontas, for instance, has been so repeated we can hardly tell where it begins and ends anymore, only that it replaces indigenous peoples within the American cultural psyche. Images are the new ideology, more so than states or even capitalism. Images are the simulation that we live in. This is the simulated reality Baudrillard is arguing about. This is the reality that we accept as the norm, the reality of images that we pray to. Baudrillard compares this to analyses of prisons, where prisons represent the social order. They represent hierarchies of power based on things like gender, race, and class, and who North American societies deem criminal. By virtue of indigenous peoples being deemed criminal in colonial societies, for instance, and being hyper present in the criminal justice system, society will also reflect that indigenous peoples belong in prisons. It's a trap of mirrored representations that harkens now to the issues we have on the internet. If an image has been so proliferated so many times, so spread through the use of the internet, that it becomes a meme of indigenous people, or maybe even a meme for indigenous people, and we can no longer remember the source of that image, what does it refer to anymore? It becomes unintelligible from the so-called real object. And we can see that through the ways that real people's lives are being torn apart because they become parts of meme culture and they go viral. So the meme becomes the real object in our society, and the person becomes the secondary object. Or as Baudrillard says, imaginary states that feed reality. So, what is the purpose of the meme of the Indian princess in the American psyche? The trope of the Indian princess is best personified through the Powhatan figure Pocahontas, who, according to John Smith's telling, dramatically saved him from near death when her father, the chief, wanted to kill him during his 17th century travels in what would become Virginia. Cultural critic Daniel Francis has argued Pocahontas came to represent the beautiful, exotic New World itself. Her story provided a model for the ideal merger of native and newcomer. Disney's film in 1995, Pocahontas, portrays Pocahontas and her supposed love affair with John Smith. Pocahontas is welcoming and inviting to John Smith and his people, unlike her unreasonable father, who sees the colonists as a threat. Pocahontas wants to learn about their life and marry the two communities for a better future for all involved. Disney's Pocahontas is the Indian maiden. She is inviting, much like the white women whom she is drawn to emulate, with a slight figure, small facial features, and a bright red pout. She is an allegory of America for a new generation of impressionable North American citizens. In the place of the grotesque and voyeuristic nature of the early allegorical representations of Native women that were in explorer journals, she's defined as other through more subtle terms, such as her ability to talk to trees and her intimate relationship with a raccoon and a hummingbird. She's always offering access to settlement on her land in the place of her father's permission, and thereby the permission of indigenous peoples through treaty. This could be seen as a metaphor for the psychic negotiation that all settler peoples have to continually undergo to take up land and space in North America, to continually make other of indigenous peoples and balance out these colonial narratives. When explorers and settlers came to the Americas and encountered indigenous communities, they found indigenous women to be in direct opposition to the heteropatriarchal norms and family structures of European societies. To legitimize the execution of settler colonialism and the removal of indigenous peoples from the land in North America, colonists and eventually the state policed indigenous women's sexual agency to regulate their bodies and thereby inhibit indigenous sovereignty by policing indigenous women. So, for instance, early prostitution laws in British Columbia were often used to intervene through legal charges into the sexual and romantic relationships of Indigenous women with white men or on Indigenous families who cohabitated with no, quote, marriage proper, end quote. And a marriage proper is, of course, a marriage under the Catholic and Christian Church, which at contact, Indigenous women did not subscribe to. They did not believe in Catholicism often. The Indian Act was the primary legal document in Canada that came into place after Confederation to police Indigenous peoples and bring them under colonial rule. Canada had sought to dispossess Indigenous peoples of peoplehood and culture through legal intervention on the bodies and families of Indigenous women, including policies that inherently sexualized Indigenous women and policed their domestic and family lives. Baudrillard is concerned with what happens to the capitalist market within hyperreality because it eliminates the traditional market where we purchase products at stores. When we buy into influencer culture, when we give someone our follow, what exactly do we buy into? It becomes more abstract. Communication studies has struggled to define this intersection of audience and influencer culture, where the influencer is trying to sell themselves, essentially. Within Marxism, the market is understood as a mechanism for the exchange of commodities under capitalism, where goods and services are traded based on their exchange value rather than their use value. It is inherently tied to the dynamics of class struggle as the market serves to reproduce capitalist relationships by obscuring the exploitation of labor through the fetishization of commodities. In Marxism, a commodity is a good or service produced for exchange in the market, possessing both use value, its utility, and its exchange value, its worth in relation to other commodities. Commodities are central to capitalist production, where their exchange value masks the labor exploitation embedded in their creation, leading to what Marx terms commodity fetishism. So, what happens to the market? What happens to commodity fetishism when the commodity itself becomes images? Baudrillard calls this the hyperspace of commodity. Commodity is everywhere all the time and is still how our culture expresses and polices itself, whether we recognize it or not. In this way, what influencers sell is ideology, much like images of Pocahontas and the Indian princess throughout time have sold colonial ideology. We can see this quite literally. So, for instance, influencers with podcasts will sell literal commodities, subscriptions, and even commercial objects for sponsorships. And those sponsorships are aligned with the political ideologies of the podcaster and its audience, of course, whether it's Joe Rogan selling workout gear and supplements to his audience of conservative men, or My Favorite Murder and domestic subscriptions aimed at middle aged women. Influencers sell themselves online in a way we all do when we circulate images of ourselves for user interaction on social media apps. We freeze ourselves in time and make ourselves a hyper commodity to be perceived and circulated. We aren't quite making ourselves objects because, again, we're discussing the repetition of images so many times that the original image no longer exists. Instead, Baudrillard says people have become a series of tests that must be answered through display. And we can think about this now through visual display on phone screens or computer screens. And this is how we identify people. For instance, think of internet subcultures. So, dark academia, Visco girls, Stanley Cup millennials. Individuals will flag certain signifiers to pass visual tests and to define their identities, and thus engage certain audiences. We become both the product and the signs that define the product, and it repeats in this sort of self-effacing cycle, like a circle. Is the internet one big hypermarket in this way? Baudrillard says the internet is just a giant montage factory. Instead of factory workers, it's a factory where we create and circulate images online. We are no longer necessarily linked to a physical workspace. Instead, we are mobile and decentered when we participate in the hypermarket by accessing the internet on our phones or laptops or iPads. The user interactions replace modes of buying. What we select, like, and schedule is now what we put our capital behind. Our creative labor becomes liking influencers and desiring their lifestyles, emulating their lifestyles. Says Baudrillard, the internet is, quote, space time of a whole operational simulation of social life. The internet is the new city, he says, because Marxism was about the city. industry and industrialization alongside the advent of new technologies and machinery. The internet is where we live, in a satellite hypermarket serviced by programs, traffic, and networks. This is cybernetics, where we connect to the digital through our body in such a way that the distinction between the real world and online and technology disappear. Baudrillard defines the hologram as a perfect simulation in which reality is reproduced in such detail that the distinction between the original and its representation completely collapses. For Baudrillard, the hologram symbolizes the hyperreal, a realm where the representation does not reflect reality but completely replaces it, erasing any sense of authenticity. What would a hologram of the Indian princess look like today? Well, the hologram would be the perfect image of all the stories that have ever been told about figures like Pocahontas in American culture, meant to normalize Western settlement. It would be a perfect clone of what our society deems that women be today. We can look back at Pocahontas and see that her representation in the Disney movie was an anxious representation, slipped into the American psyche at a moment when Indigenous land rights were in the international media because of Indigenous political movements like the Oka Crisis. Things have changed, though. Now we have representation that attempts to honor more closely Indigenous experiences. We have Moana, an Indian princess who was just made a demigod in Moana 2, and whose representation is much more authentic to the people that she represents. And what happens to the Indian princess online in this era of representation? Well, she continues to replace actual Indigenous women who wrote Moana, who produced, directed, and primarily starred in it, who animated it, who consumes it. This was still an act of image making, of representation, and one that tells a fantastical and mythical story, certainly not necessarily the actual story of Indigenous life today. Let's take this a step further. In recent years, famous actors, directors, and artists have been questioned by the media and Indigenous communities about their Indigenous identity claims. Some individuals are claiming Indigenous status based on distant ancestry, or even no Indigenous ancestry at all. For instance, the Canadian director Michelle Latimer directed the Trickster series on CBC and claimed Indigenous identity, but was found out to be a fraud and not Indigenous at all. This was a huge public scandal. Similar to this, there was a popular Indigenous meme page called Decolonize Springfield because it drew from Simpsons imagery, which was well circulated within digital Indigenous communities on Instagram and Facebook. In 2022, one of the moderators was called out by the Blackfoot community that she claimed to be from. The community's question was never answered about where this individual was from. However, the meme page was eventually deactivated and completely deleted. What is troubling about this is that the moderator had so much influence within and support from Indigenous people online. She had so successfully picked up a vernacular that has united Indigenous peoples across territories, a digital powwow trail in memes. Yet she was able to pick it up in such a way that she could use it as a form of digital Redface to become indecipherable from an actual indigenous person and to reap personal benefits from appearing to be an indigenous person. She became the image repeated so many times that it actually replaced real indigenous peoples. And this is a terrifying settler colonial reality in an era where simulated reality is now a hyper reality that contains us all as digital citizens. Could an image of the original be good enough in a settler society? Certainly for the colonial machine that wants to replace us, that wants to subdue us, that quite literally wants to kill us out. The native hologram is the perfect tool, the perfect simulation to disappear us in an era of internet hyper commodity. As Baudrillard says, the hologram, the perfect image, or the end of the imaginary.